Should go ahead and get started here. Thank you all very much for joining us at this panel. You know, there's a lot of stuff to look at, a lot of stuff to do here this weekend, which is why we are all here, and which why we're all so grateful to the organizers, such as Lauren, who, despite her propensity to feed me lies about previous interview subjects, otherwise it's fine, basically. And I am very pleased to be here with Sophia Foster-Dimino, who is a wonderfully talented, thoughtful artist, both visually and in terms of story, and who has been getting some much-deserved recognition and actual ability to pay one's rent in exchange for that, which we should all live in a society that is so just. The format for this is that Sophia has been gracious enough to arrange a slideshow of her past work. Are there influences in here too?
Yeah, it's basically the structure is I'm going to talk about 4 comics that I've done in the past year.
Talk like 4 times louder.
I'm going to talk about 4 comics that I've done in the past year and cite the inspirations and influences for each of them, and talk a bit about my process as well.
So, with no further ado, welcome to hell, Sophia. If you're not following her on Twitter, you should. It's a great thing. Should we go ahead with the slideshow?
Sorry?
You want to go ahead with the slideshow?
Yeah, sure.
All right. So this is Batman.
Yeah, this is Batman. I did this when I was about 6 years old. And the reason that I included this slide was just to talk a little bit about my upbringing, but not a lot because I'd like to move on to the other stuff. I was born in Virginia, and when I was 2, I moved to Florida. I went to school at the Rhode Island School of Design in Rhode Island, Providence, Rhode Island. And then I moved to the Bay Area shortly after graduating, after interning in Boston for a bit. And I've been here for 3 years, and I've been doing comics since freshman year of college.
Did you hate Boston?
No, I liked it.
Okay.
Well, I technically lived in Cambridge.
Okay. Everyone I know who has spent any time in Boston is just like,
no, it's fine.
So, moving on from that now.
Yeah, this is a comic that I did in late 2012 called In Camera.
And the projector is not fantastic, but you do have some books here.
Yeah, actually.
Is there anything you can pass around for books to see as you're talking?
I can pass around the very book that has this comic in it.
Here, let me give you some.
So this is the anthology Happiness.
Let me
just find mine. This is the anthology Happiness, put out by Leo Wishnia, who's from Brooklyn. And this was, I'll just bookmark it and look through it as I talk about it. My style in the 3 or so comics I've done leading up to this was tending more towards the use of isometric perspective. And I was getting really obsessed with it, and while I was doing this presentation, I was trying to piece together why that was so interesting to me. The story is very loose. It's basically a couple who escapes from a facility, and they move to the right across the page as far as they can until they reach a door that they can't pass through. And can I just page through this?
Can you also just explain real quickly what isometric perspective is?
So isometric perspective is a kind of perspective where the lines you use to draw, even if they are lines of parallel objects in space, they are parallel on the page as well. That is, they never converge. There's no vanishing point. He's illustrating this for us. Basically they move across the page, move into other structures, and this sort of idea of characters moving through a space rather than just talking heads inhabiting the same space for the duration of the story was influenced by a lot of cartoonists that I like. This is Henry McCausland. He's a British cartoonist. His work has been in a few of the No-Brow anthologies, and he does stories that really resonate with me, sort of about people who live in abandoned, sort of indeterminate culture type spaces where the wilderness is overcoming civilization, and the characters act that way as well. And this is John DeWitt. He's from South Africa. He's another illustrator that I really respect, who's kind of on the same wavelength as me, and we've corresponded a lot. And his stories are also about people exploring a strange, vast space, and you're always from the same sort of fixed perspective. There are never really any close-ups or shots of dialogue. It's just sort of this very remote point of view of people exploring an unknown area. And the other influence, I would say, is Mobius, who has had an incredibly varied career, but I feel like architecture and space is always very important for him, more so than a lot of other sci-fi artists who focus more on the characters and the costume design. He clearly cares very much about establishing the sense of the culture through the buildings. And as I was thinking more about this when I was working on my presentation, I realized that there's a fine artist, Chirico, who's also really got this thing going on. He uses isometric perspective, but in a way that sort of clashes with reality, that's very inconsistent, that gives you a sense of architecture that should be symmetrical, but is breaking down in the image so that it's no longer internally consistent. And thinking further about this, I remembered one of my favorite video games, actually, Eco, was directly inspired by Chirico's work. And this sort of train of thought got me thinking, well, maybe my fascination with isometric perspective comes from video games. This is Earthbound, a Super Nintendo title, which uses isometric perspective almost exclusively. So now I was really thinking, well, the point of view in a video game like this kind of gives you a godlike perspective on the world. You're very distant from the characters. You can't really see their expressions or anything. They're just moving through this immense space, and the narrative arc in games like this is really about exploration. You start in your hometown, you leave, you go out into the world, and there are more and more dangers that you face. And another good example of this is Pokemon, which was like the first video game that I played religiously at a young age. Hit when I was around 5th grade, and it was really one of the most insane like culture storms of my generation. And this influence can be seen in other work of mine. This is a little GIF animation that I did. I have a big interest in video games that I'm trying to reconcile with my interest in illustration and comics. So something like this one day might make its way into a game with structure, but since I need a programmer for that, right now I just kind of make these weird standalone scenes that seem to imply a story, but this is actually all there is. There's something more than this. But I'm hoping that people of my generation who have this like intense video game nostalgia that they can't reconcile with their daily life will see this and kind of like get the wavelength that I'm on. So
before we move on too far, so what did you learn about why you like isometric perspective? Because it sounds like it's something that gets used a lot to, you know, with unfamiliar terrain, the exploration of unfamiliar terrain, and sort of the super flattening of a world where everything seems to have equal significance. Nothing's further away in the background.
Yeah, if I can just go to the next slide, that will explain a lot of what you just asked. This is a sketch image that I made for the comic that's being passed around. What I did was I basically drew the environment like completely and then superimposed it on every panel as if the panel itself was like the eye of the camera and the environment was a stage set that I was just moving around underneath the camera. I don't really know if other people work this way, and it is a really backwards way of working, but I was really compelled to do it. I guess because I was trying to think about point of view, which is something so important in film and in stage work. And there seems to be a big difference when you think about like handheld cameras and documentary filmmaking that are up close with people and getting their personal perspective, as opposed to like a stage set where you're physically very distant from the players and everything is meticulously arranged. But it's sort of the actors going over the same set periodically and with new information changes the entire feel of the story. So that's kind of what I was trying to do with this. I was saying if the panel is the camera, and then I just move the environment under it, and the characters progress in one direction as far as they can. That to me was what compelled me to do this story like this. I don't know if I can explain it any further than that, though, unfortunately.
Well, can you talk about, so what kind of, what's the end result of working in a movie like this versus working in something with close-ups?
I feel that if you work too much with close-ups, you get really caught up in dialogue, and I don't think comics are really that well suited to dialogue. It's hard to convey like the cadence of someone's voice or the things that they're talking about even. So I try to really like reject the desire to have dialogue, because I do actually like writing dialogue, I can get carried away with it, but I think it's much more suited to the medium to show people progressing through a space and interacting with the environment and having some sort of physical aspect to their story.
Do you find like you set this up as a challenge to yourself to like sort of surprise yourself in what comes out in the process by setting up a situation where you can't do dialogue the thing you really want to do?
Yeah, I think so. Especially with this story, because I had this sort of weird construction that I wanted to impose on myself. I basically said, here, I'll make the environment, and then I have these characters, and I'll just kind of run them through the environment, and then the dialogue was almost like an afterthought. So I would compose a panel with the characters in the environment, and just do something that seemed right at the time. I guess it's more like kind of playing a board game with characters. Like I didn't plan the story, I just sort of made the reality and the characters that go in it, and then I combined them and sort of figured out what happened along the way. And this is just one other shot from the same story.
Can folks see these reasonably well?
They might make more sense when you're looking through the book, but yeah, so there are other cartoonists who use this approach, sort of. This is Joost Zwart, a Dutch cartoonist, who is really amazing. And he uses isometric perspective almost exclusively. And you can really see that it's sort of like the lens of a camera panning over a static space, and the characters just moving through that. It's almost like a dollhouse that he's populated with these characters that he's then like playing pretend with them. It's really interesting. I think that it sort of dynamically produces new creative impulses when you think of characters in the environment in this way. So then this is the last page of the story, where the character has just kind of gotten to the end of the universe, because I didn't draw anything more than that. And so the result was kind of just like a fatalistic, like, if you're in a video game and you reach the end of the world because they didn't program anything else, there's no choice but to stop at that point. So this was an experiment for sure, but it was really interesting to me. And we can move on to the next talk at this point, unless you have more questions.
No, let's get into it.
The next one? Okay. So I'm going to talk about a comic I did for Antiques Roadshow, which is edited and published by Alison Dubois, who's sitting right there in this It's called her out.
Folks who are at the reading on Thursday night at the Cartoon Art Museum, this is one of the comics that you read?
Yes, this is the comic that I read. I'll pass this around too, but it's basically 3 pages, and the idea is that there are a bunch of characters who go to the Antiques Roadshow and they bring their stuff with them, and then the entire story is based around those 3 objects. So there's a sort of bonsai plant that has baby heads instead of flowers. And then there's a cuckoo clock that has like a different thing coming out of it every hour. And then there's this
cuckoo clock that tells the story of the cuckoo clock maker's day.
Yes, yeah. Which is in here. So I'll just bookmark this and people can look through it. Sorry, I might be hard to say it, but and then there's this abacus that predicts when someone will die, and I just kind of took those 3 ideas and ran with them. So the main motivation behind this comic was thinking about objects as a way to tell stories, because again, I think a lot of my motivation in all of my comics has been trying to move away from just having like people talking to each other, because I think that is not the best thing to do with a comic. Like, that's great for movies or TV, but comics you can do so much more and so much more interesting things. So I was thinking, like, what if I based these stories just around the objects and the people who have them? And one touchstone for this, this is a Chris Ware comic where he basically shows the same lamp over the course of like 150 years, and you never see any people in the whole comic. It's just bubbles of dialogue sort of heard from off screen, showing you that basically this lamp has been passed down through the ages, it's been sold off, it's been traded, it's gotten beaten up, it's changed its lampshade. And you gain like an incredible amount of information about people just from overhearing these snippets and seeing the lamp travel from place to place. So I thought, you know, like objects, physical objects are inanimate, but they're also designed by people, and they can only move if people move them. So I was really interested in the potential of telling a story just through like these objects. This is the one page that Shannon was talking about, where it's basically cuckoo clock.
Don't do that thing where you talk to the screen.
Okay. I can't read it if I. Okay. There's a cuckoo clock, and every hour these sort of marionette figures are positioned in a new way, and it tells the story of the craftsman's day based on what he was doing at that time. And part of why I did this was because 2013 was the first year that I participated in Hourly Comics Day, which is, I think, is February 1st, and it's basically like you wake up in the morning and you do a comic for every hour that you were awake, and you talk about what you did. And it was really difficult for me because I'm like such a planning type person, and it took most of my day. And then I was like 2 weeks late with them.
You also did every hour you were asleep as well.
Yeah, I did the hours I was asleep too. I tried to remember my dreams roughly during the time when I had them, and I included those as well. They're not here, unfortunately, but they're on my Tumblr. And what interested me about this was that it makes you throw off any desire to think about like the narrative arc of a story or like the theme of the story. You just kind of focus on the details and you say exactly what happened. But then when you look at it at the end of the day, usually there is some sort of theme running through it that you didn't even plan on. It just sort of emerges because you have a personality and things that you do. So this was really telling for me. Like at the end of the day, I was like depressed and I went on a walk and we had a really deep conversation about illustration and what it was doing to our lives. And I couldn't have like written a story like this. It just sort of happened. I would encourage everyone to like do an hourly comics day for once in their life. Even if you don't draw, it's an amazing exercise. So yeah, that's pretty much all I have to say about the Antiques Roadshow one.
Let me back up a little bit, because I thought this was a really fascinating comic, and I think it brings up some stuff that appears in other comics. One thing I think that separates comics as a medium from books or film, TV, is its ability to convey rhythm while still having certain cinematic quality. So with TV, with film, it's all like pretty much everything's happening in chronological order, like every frame happens after the previous frame. And with a book, like you can control rhythm by how you arrange the words on the page, like how you present them, but there is no image. So the comics are getting the best of both of those worlds and able to do something else with it. And here, on this particular page, you've done something really unusual with how the actual comic is laid out.
Yeah. You
have the object in the middle, but then there are very few parallel lines even in the rest of the piece.
Yeah.
What's wrong with you?
It was actually really difficult to format this one. I'm not good at layout. It's one of my weakest points. I think when people are starting, they just kind of go with like a 3x3 grid or a 4x4 grid and stick to that. And that's actually like a great way to work. You can do everything like controlling rhythm and pace just with that very simple grid. You don't really need to get fancy.
And there's a lot of comics like Watchmen is all.
Yeah. And in that, even the grid is like very thematically relevant to the story, and the rhythms occur and reoccur in every single issue, and there's really like a design to it that's really interesting. I was thinking about trying new layouts. Actually, so a friend of mine, Angie Wang, who's an amazing cartoonist, did a comic for a Garo-inspired anthology where she was basically really influenced by manga layout, which is very, very rarely like grid-based. It's usually like these crazy panels, expanding panels, panels laid on top of other panels, panels that are bleeding into like weird shapes, and like it's just very, very interesting and totally liberated, and I had no capacity to work in that way. So this is like my attempt to go in that direction, but as you can see, it's still really geometric. And I don't know if I'll be able to get into that because it's my personality, but it was an interesting experiment.
Can you talk a little bit about the objects that show up? So the book is going around now, and I think folks are reading it, but the three objects are a tree that grows porcelain baby heads that promotes fertility, a cuckoo clock that tells the day of the cuckoo clock maker, basically like the Daily Comics idea of it inside a cuckoo clock. So the cuckoo clock shows the cuckoo clock maker waking up, going to a cafe, going to work, seeing a cute waitress, and then during the day having sex with a waitress in this really weird mechanized cuckoo clock. And then for lack of a better word, protagonist, the main character of the piece that she brings to the Antique Roadshow is this abacus, and it turns out that it is an abacus that can predict the time of your death. And the TV show host says, "Oh, we can just demonstrate it on you right now," and then asks her the questionnaire, and it's all gender, prefer not to say, I guess I'm using female pronouns, but smoker, non-smoker, interests, how much do you have cable TV, and these all have representations on the abacus. And then it's pretty clear that it turns out that she's going to die really, really soon, and the TV host just doesn't want to say it.
Yeah.
And then the comic ends.
Yep. Sorry.
All three of these objects, so there is some obvious like elements of Trinity here. So there's like birth, life, and death.
Oh yeah. Sorry. Yeah. Cool.
Or there's different modes of function, different modes of time. Like the three of these can be seen representing any number of Trinities. Which would you like to pretend that you thought up previously to this? Sophia.
Well, okay, so I don't know if I can get away with this, but like one thing I found when I was researching this presentation was that I do a lot of things by instinct, and then they do have like a weird order to them. I'm not saying that to say that I'm like a genius who can think of these things without actually articulating them, but like I have a very like organizational mind, and I do structure things even if I'm trying not to. I can't help but kind of have a rhythm to things in that way. Like it's really hard for me to do things that are super unstructured and loose, which is why it takes me a really long time to do anything. But for this one, I think I knew that I wanted to do something about fertility symbols because it's just really interesting to me, and we'll get to it in my next comic, which is more about that. But I was thinking a lot about motherhood at the time, and motherhood anxiety. And then the cuckoo clock one, again, was because I was doing the hourly comics. And then the abacus, I'm pretty sure that just came about because I like the design of abacuses. I think they look cool. And then I formed a story that makes sense. So it's not always like serving a higher function. Sometimes it's just motivated by pure aesthetic interest, but usually something emerges that makes it seem like it was an intentional structure. Thanks for pointing that out.
All right.
Should I move on to this?
Yes.
Okay. So this next comic is called Mother. And I did it for an anthology called Mother that's being published by an Italian publisher called Delabile. And this anthology is actually debuting at SPX in 2 weeks in Bethesda, Maryland, if anyone's going to that. This one was interesting because it had to be themed around motherhood, and my mother is actually Italian, and the final comic had to be in Italian, so I was going to ask her to translate it, which probably would have made her really uncomfortable, but as it turns out, they translated it for me. And the way the comic works is that there are 5 pages, and these are the headers of each of the 5 pages. The first one is when the mother is a college student who gets pregnant and has a baby. The second one is when the baby is 1 year old and just sort of like a toddler. The third one is when the child is sort of like a preteen between 5 and 10. The fourth one is when the kid is a teenage girl, and then the last one is when the mother is aged and on her deathbed, and her daughter has children of her own. And it's just sort of like an entire life compressed into 5 pages. So part of the inspiration for this was I had just finished reading The Baron and the Trees by Italo Calvino. These are illustrations by a guy whose name is really hard to pronounce. His name is Jan Nascimento, I think.
Good job.
Do you know? Or do you just come for me? Okay, thanks. So this story is about, it's sort of like a magical realism story about a guy, a kid who decides to climb a tree and then he decides to never come down, and he lives in the trees for his entire life until he dies. And that's the entire book. It's sort of like the life arc of a man compressed into basically a novella. It's like a little over 100 pages. And I had never done anything really long form. So I had never gotten near the idea of like showing an entire person's life in one story, but the idea really interested me. And around the same time, or a little earlier, I was reading Lint by Chris Ware, which I have here and I can show and pass around. So this is book number 20 in the Acme Novelty Library, which is a series that Chris Ware has been doing for his whole life. And basically, every page in this book is a year in the man's life. So it starts out when he is an infant, and can't see color and sees everything very abstractly. And then he becomes a toddler and learns about his bodily functions and stuff like that. And then a bit later he is in school, his mother dies, you realize that he's a bully, he becomes a teenager, the colors get very loud. He buys a house, he has 2 kids, and eventually he dies. This is something else, but I can pass that on. So I was really interested in that, and I was amazed at showing just the life arc of a character in a really condensed format. So what I did with the story was I had 5 pages like this, where I just showed one isolated incident from that point in the life of this mother and child. This one in particular I wanted to explain a little bit, because during the reading I think people were a little confused by it. This is basically a tradition in Korean families where when the kid is 1 year old, you put them down with a whole bunch of different objects, and then you let the kid kind of grab the one they like. And the idea is that it determines what they'll go on to be when they grow up. Like if they grab a fork, I guess you wouldn't put a fork in front of a 1 year old, but something like that. If they grab a fork, they turn into a chef. If they grab money, they turn into a banker. If they grab food, they turn into a gourmand, or like when I actually attended one of these, my coworker had a baby who turned 1, and there was like a little toy dump truck, and they were like, he's going to become a dump truck man or something. And I was really fascinated by this whole tradition, because it seemed to me that the kid would just go for like whatever they found most familiar. Not necessarily, like if you put a pile of money in front of a toddler, like they've never seen it before, maybe they're interested in it because of that, or maybe they are not interested in it because it doesn't register for them. But that had me thinking, like actually what determines what you are when you grow up usually is the things that you're most familiar with, for whatever reason. Like if your parents have stuff lying around the house that influences you, even if you're not particularly, if your identity doesn't mesh with those things, it still kind of like leads you down a path. And I was thinking of this because of the interview I did with Liz for the ZineFest website, where I was thinking, like when I was a kid, I drew a picture of some orcas, like that I copied from a Lisa Frank folder, and some older girls thought it was really great. And I was like so amazed that I could impress older girls that I started drawing all the time, and now it's like my thing that I'm doing for the rest of my life. So this one in particular, I was just thinking that very small things at a young age do impact people quite a lot.
Yeah, there are a couple of things about this piece that I really enjoyed. The headers I thought were especially interesting. Thank you. First of all, that they also seem to harken back to a certain element of computer graphics. That they really look like wingdings.
Yeah, that's actually a big thing for me. I really like Unicode characters and wingdings and like ASCII art and stuff like that. That's interesting.
They also remind me of Tove Jansson. Yes, who does the Moomins. If folks aren't familiar with the Moomins, prepare to lose like a month of your life just absorbing everything involving the Moomins because it's all wonderful. The Moomins.
Yeah.
Moomins.
Is it drawn poorly or Fantagraphics? What's that?
I think it's Fantagraphics.
Yeah, Fantagraphics put out or republished a collection of her comics. She did them in British newspapers for like 30 plus years, and then her brother took over after a point. But it's basically the story of these like trolls that live on an island and are really adorable. But she worked. It's for kids, but she works in a lot of really adult themes and satire and stuff like that.
And in the comic, so this exists in a lot of different mediums because it's been adapted to a lot of different mediums. But in the comic, one thing that she does that I've never seen anyone else do that I love is that it's like a typical like 3, 4 panel comic, but the dividers will be like, if they're making a campfire, the dividers will be sticks. If they're inside eating dinner, the dividers will be like candles and candle holders. It's an interesting way just to sort of reiterate, like, yes, you are looking at a comic, yes, this is a drawing, and the story is still here, the story is still valid. Isn't it nice to look at this object?
Yeah, I actually have been very influenced by that exact specific thing, for sure. It's not in a page that I put in the slideshow, but there is a page of this comic where it's sort of like a dream sequence, and there are clouds and speech bubbles that act as panel borders also. So that was really fascinating. And the other thing that I really Let's see.
Nice.
Sorry.
You're talking about borders, totally on.
Oh yeah. So I think that's another way that I think about comics that's more similar to the like stage direction of a play, for example, where everything is sort of presented from the same perspective, and then the divisions between scenes are sort of just formalities, like, you know, the curtain lowers and then it goes up, and now this is a new day, and everyone in the audience just sort of like buys it. They're like, yep, a day has passed. Like, I love that suspension of disbelief. I think it's a real mistake to go too far down the road of realism and try and make everything as lifelike as possible, because you're never going to bridge the gap, and readers have such a capacity for imagination that you should play to that. You should let people fill in the gaps for you and bring their creativity to the table when you make a creative work. I think that that's one of the main differences between genres of comics that I like or dislike, is there are some people who use panel borders as just like a window into a world that you can always look at it from a different angle. And it's very sort of action-packed and inspires vertigo a little bit, because they have to, like, if you go into a building, you have to show this like crazy three-point perspective building, and it's just very kind of abrasive to me when I'm reading stuff like that. I would much rather just sort of have the elements proposed to me so that I can interpret them, sort of like more as a cartoon, as like a symbol that you would read on a page as if it's a letter, rather than showing someone a photograph of something. You show them a symbol of that, and then they bring their own interpretation of that.
It's actually something, because that's something that also came up with Roman in our previous interview today, like when he was talking about his work, that he also hates the idea of how conversations are presented in typical media, that it's like your typical episode of Friends, just every single line is funny, is a zinger, leads on to some extra plot point. And what Roman says he tries to do in his work is that if you actually sit down and write down a conversation between two people, it's almost not even language.
Yeah.
They're just mumbling, people saying like constantly. And so his effort to sort of like fuck with the idea of suspension of disbelief is just to present that as plainly as possible.
Yeah.
And so it's interesting to hear you talking about wanting to create that same suspension of disbelief by working with the form rather than working with the dialogue itself.
Yeah. It's really stressful for me to consume any sort of media that's like geared to be pure entertainment, because it just rings false and it kind of betrays the prejudices of the person who made it, that they think that this one thing should appeal to everyone. So I would much rather someone kind of take like a cinema verite approach to it and show something honestly, or their vision of something honestly, and then people can interpret that however they want, rather than trying to force your own interpretation of something on someone.
One other thing I want to ask you about this comic, and I made sure to talk to Roman about fatherhood, because I hate to be interviewer and be like, so what's it like being a woman?
Yeah.
So I made sure to ask Roman what's it like being a woman first.
Okay, alright, you may continue.
But cover my ass on this one. How do you feel about fatherhood? Is this something that this is something that shows up in a couple of pieces, like the fertility statue with this piece especially, of this woman who has a baby and doesn't really seem to want to have become a mother in the first place at any point.
Yeah, well, so the mother character in this story, again, I guess I don't have a set perspective on her. I really wanted to show someone who was contradictory, and that some people would see her and think that she was really irresponsible, and then some people would see her and sympathize with her. I think that most mothers are like that. Like, they have moments in your life where they can appear like villains, but then when you get older, you realize that, of course, there are motivations behind all these things, and people behave as well as they can, but sometimes they don't, and it's really complicated. But for me personally, yeah, I think that it's something that you just have to deal with. The pressure, at least, like not the actual behavior.
Right.
Even if you're completely 100% like comfortable in your desire to never have children, the pressures will never leave you alone.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Definitely. I've got something really profound to say, I swear to God. How do you think motherhood affects an artist? Because you talked a little bit in the previous interview about how fatherhood affects an artist. But motherhood
Yeah.
probably has a very different role. in
Well,
society.
actually, like the only thing I can think of is to talk about fatherhood because I was rereading Chris Ware a lot when I did this piece because he's a big influence on me. But he actually has famously a story in the really large Kramer's Ergot where he has a life-size baby. Basically, there's this anthology called Kramer's Ergot, and one of the issues is extremely large. And he used it as an opportunity to show a baby life-size on the page and then surrounded by all of these panels talking about what it was like to have a baby. And I think it was really good for him because if you read his early work, he sort of has this like very repressed aggression towards the idea of family, which I think a lot of artists have because they feel like it's the thing that you're supposed to do with your life as a human being, but at the same time, being an artist is so difficult that I think that it's impossible to avoid reaching the point where you feel like you can't provide the ideal life for them because you give so much time to your work while you don't make very much money. So I think that people can feel very bitter about that. But for him, I think it's worked out really well for him, and he's had a really good relationship with his daughter. And the other person that I think of when I bring this up is David Lynch, who made Eraserhead entirely about the anxiety about becoming a father, and just sort of the thought that by accident you can make a human being that you're responsible for, which is a terrifying idea for both people involved in making a baby. But for him, it's also been the same thing that despite that anxiety when he was a very young man, he has really had a new appreciation for life entirely out of raising his daughter. And that's affected his work a lot. So I cannot comment about myself in the future, but I think those artists that I respect, it's been good for them.
But just fatherhood.
Yeah, no, I'm trying to think of female cartoonists.
I don't want to put too fine a point on, but I am really interested in this issue because I think it is a place where gender roles and gender, what's the word I'm looking for? The paths that men and women have into different careers really diverge around parenthood. That men can keep being artists, and women often their responsibilities totally change, and they are expected by society not just to have a kid, but then to become a mother and nothing else once they have a kid.
Yeah.
Men can be a father second.
Yeah, I have been absorbing a lot of dialogue about that recently because I work at a tech company, so everyone is talking about lean in and all of that. I think it's a little bit different for artists, but I don't really know. I would never have a child if I thought that I would be the only one responsible for it. Well, I don't know. I mean, it depends. People can't really predict these things.
Right.
I think for cartoonists, for sure, just based on my own community, I think it's a little more egalitarian than for a CEO, which is what most people are talking about these days. Yeah. Sorry, I haven't.
No, that's good. Thank you. This is heavy stuff. Let's
Yeah.
get into it.
Yeah, sure.
Shall we continue with the fourth and final comment?
Yeah, I can talk about the last one. So this is a little comic I did. It's not even really a comic, it's just sort of a book. Here it is. I was giving it away for free at my table, and actually there are only 2 copies left. So I'm sorry, I should.
I got one.
Okay, yeah, sorry. Some people have one. So I did this in a week and a half, and I didn't sketch it or plan it at all, which is really unusual for me, which hopefully everyone can appreciate looking at everything else I've done up until this point. But I wanted to have something to bring here that was just really loose and unstructured, unlike everything else I do. And I was partially inspired by this other book by Eleanor Davis with a really long title that I'll have to read out. Okay, it's called 31 Drawings That Have Something to Do with Being in Love and Not Being in Love. And I can pass both of these around.
Eleanor Davis does Wee Wee Ouija, is that right?
Yep. She's really great. I am obsessed with her. She's one of my favorite cartoonists. And when I got this little book, I was really impacted by it. It's basically just a collection of drawings that have a lot of emotional weight, but very vague and hard to understand emotional weight. It's the sort of book that some people read through and they just don't connect with it at all, and they think it's weird and obscure, and they put it away. And then some people like me look through it and it just really resonates with them. It was the case for me that this book was like really, really powerful for me to read. And I felt that we were communicating on some like arcane wavelength that only artists can communicate on. But non-artists can get a lot out of this too, obviously. And I was really fascinated by the power that this book had over me. And I started thinking about other things that had brought about that reaction in me. Basically, the feeling that you're connected with the author. Usually when I read a story, like the author is more present to varying degrees. Sometimes you read a story and it just seems like they put on a show for you and you appreciate it, but it doesn't really tell you anything about their personality. And then in some cases, an artist pours their entire soul into their work. And when you're done reading their book, you feel like you know them to a degree. And then it's really weird if you go to a convention and you say hi to them and they don't know you, but you feel like you know a lot about them. It's just sort of like a weird emotional terrain. And I was wondering if I could like do something like this. Basically, like put myself out there and just see whether people connected with my random thoughts or not. And another book that kind of falls into this category, this is a journal by Julie Delport. This is put out by Crayon Press. It was originally in French and then republished in English at TCAF this year. It's basically just a book of illustrated journal entries. Presented entirely without censorship. She's like really, really honest in these, and she uses this beautiful colored pencil style. And it covers the course of the year, actually, similarly to other things I've talked about. It's like an arc of time that you can understand completely when you've read the entire book. And this book was really interesting for me because I actually, after TCAF and after reading this book, I went to stay with Julie in Montreal. And this is an Instagram photo I took of reading the book in her living room and seeing the lamp that she drew on the page in one of her diary entries. And this like blew my mind because I just felt like so close to her at that moment and reading this incredibly emotional diary. And then she like got home from yoga and she was like, hey, and I was like, hey. And I didn't know how to tell her that I felt like I knew all this like really intimate information about her and I felt really close to her, but she like, it was sort of like a one-way street, like she didn't really get anything about me from that experience. And in recent months, I've been reading a lot of like really, really small zines that no one has heard of, that are just like super personal. And they're not always in the form of zines. Sometimes it's just like someone's Tumblr that I come across where they have, 1 to 5 notes on every entry, and it's just them talking about some traumatic experience that they're going through, just sort of like sending their emotions out into the void, and that really like spoke to me. And I was reading some zines about gender identity where people just like put all of their thoughts out on the page and photographs and poems and interviews and just trying to like take something that no one else can see and make it concrete so that they can explain to people without having to have a conversation what's going on with them. And speaking of that, when I was in Montreal, I went to a reading that Julie gave at the Drawing Quarterly shop. And she talked about one of her inspirations for this book, which was a zine that a guy who I can't remember his name, but the zine was called like, How Are You Doing? And basically he made a zine every month, and if someone asked him, how are you doing? He would just hand the zine. And the zine basically served as an answer to that question. So it was like a list of all his anxieties at the time, recent like funny experiences he'd had, and stuff about himself, like his favorite food. So he would just give it to people as a way to explain himself. And I was thinking about this because I think that I had like a similar problem where I couldn't really articulate my feelings. So I decided to make that zine to get some stuff down that I felt like I couldn't explain in words and just see whether people reacted to it.
Yeah, I thought sex fantasy.
Oh yeah, it's called sex fantasy.
It's called sex fantasy. To be clear, I'm not just saying sex fantasy.
I can explain the title actually really quickly, if you want.
I kind of like my theory, but...
Okay, I'd like to hear.
No, it's private. Go ahead.
Okay. I called it sex fantasy because I, 1, wanted people to be interested in it, and 2, I wanted to get across the idea of something that was so personal that you couldn't explain it to anyone, that you had to sort of have like a one-on-one conversation with them to really get where they were coming from, and you have to have like an emotional relationship with them to understand what that means for them. And to me, like, sexuality is one of those things where it's just so personal for everyone that you really have to have a trusted relationship in order to convey your feelings about it. So that was why I called it that, even though there's no sex in the zine.
There was when I read it.
Oh, okay.
So folks, we are just about out of time. I think if folks have questions? Raise your hand if you've got a question. Virgie?
I'm just absorbing.
So do you feel like you are... You sound like someone who's an artist who really enjoys working in the media and the ideas of contemporary culture. And I say this as opposed to someone like Roman, who like doesn't even want to hang out there and he's alive.
I think that, I don't want to talk about him instead of me, although I think it's...
I'm sort of keep bringing it up.
I think it's interesting with him because he does give the impression of being really involved with like the old time, but he is actually like pretty engaged in contemporary culture in a certain way. Like he's really fascinated by kitsch and weird TV shows. Like, do you know Dog the Bounty Hunter?
Oh yes.
He's obsessed with that, which people do not know when they meet him. But so I think it's multi-layered for him, and it also for me. Like we have similar interests in authors who have been dead for 50 to 100 years, but you know, they retain relevance just in a way that they couldn't predict.
Do you think the idea of the confessional has changed for culture, for society in the last, like, since the advent of the internet, Tumblr, everything else?
Yeah, it's definitely become more of a thing, and it's welcomed more and embraced more and respected more, which I think is definitely a really good thing. Like I can't imagine what life would be like for people in a time when it wasn't comparatively safe to express certain things that are now more acceptable to express. It was really convoluted, but I hope you get what I was trying to say. Yeah, I definitely welcome it. I think that there's a little bit of a stigma when it comes to just spilling your guts and putting everything out there. Like, people consider it a little bit of a faux pas, and they want to get this controlled, entertaining experience. But there's an equal number of people who are really welcoming towards stuff like that, and I like them. I'm going to stick with those guys.
All right, well, folks, I think that's as good a note to end on as any. I really wish that this could go on for another 150 hours. So I'm just going to bug you on Twitter.
Yeah, really.
And what's your Twitter handle?
Sophia. Like Sophia and
So, folks, thank you very much for joining us here. Oh, wait, one last question. Do you have anything new coming out people should be looking to spend money on?
Oh, yes. I have a book coming out with Retrofit in November, and I guess that might be debuting at Cartoon Arts Brooklyn. If you're into that.
In the meantime, you can buy a bunch of Sophia's stuff at the center table, and you should go do that. Give her your money. She's great, and don't forget to give her books back also, which she has books back to the audience. Thank you very much for all of you for joining us here today.
Thanks, guys.